News, this is Judy Muller. It's still go for launch at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, despite earlier fears that a storm moving in from the west might cause a delay. Christopher Glenn reports.
The pace quickens at Cape Canaveral as the final checkout of orbiter and launch vehicle systems is performed by the six-man crew, long since strapped in their seats and ready to ride. The day started with a flood of sunshine. High clouds dominate now, but NASA's Hugh Harris says conditions are still satisfactory for an on-time launch.
The only concern is that there are some patches of broken to overcast skies over the Orlando area. We'll be watching to make sure that they don't move into this area and prevent the visibility required in case of a return to launch site aboard.
It's a big payload this time. The European-built Spacelab fills the shuttle's cargo bay. But all appears to be ready. Launch time, less than an hour away. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center, Florida. I'm Chris Glenn, CBS News, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We're nearing the end of a planned 10-minute hold in the countdown to launch of Shuttle 9 and the European-built Spacelab just about a half hour from now. The count has been butter smooth so far. We should note, however, that NASA has a contingency plan for every situation. One of them calls for a return to the Cape and landing here should something go wrong early in the flight. Spencer Allen is now atop the huge building where the launch vehicles are assembled and can see where they would return if needed. Spencer?
I've been watching astronaut Bob Crippen making practice approaches to the runway here about a mile and a half northwest of us. He's checking out wind conditions as they affect his jet trainer, and that information will be relayed to Commander John Young in the event Columbia would have to make an emergency return to launch site shortly after liftoff.
Okay, Spence, half an hour to go now. No problems to report. I'm Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center, Florida. The flight of Shuttle 9. I'm Christopher Glenn, CBS News, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Well, there they are. There they sit. The familiar sight, the shuttle on the pad, clinging to its giant main fuel tanks, which is flanked by two auxiliary solid rocket boosters, and they are ready to go. There are just about 3 minutes and 35 seconds left before this countdown ends, and the fiery rocket ride into space begins once again. There's a lot that's new this time around, however. For the first time, there will be a six-man crew aboard, and that is the largest team of astronauts ever launched into space. This flight also marks the return of the orbiter Columbia for its sixth journey into space. It's been out of action the last several flights, being refurbished and getting ready for this flight. Special configurations were needed because this flight carries the long-awaited European-built Spacelab. It occupies almost the entire cargo bay and is a 10-year project which cost the European Space Agency $1 billion. STS-9 will be the longest flight to date. Also, it will last almost exactly 9 days, give or take a few seconds. For the first time, as we said, 6 crewmen will be launched. They will work in shifts. There will be a red team and a blue team, 3 men each, so that scientific operations can go on 24 hours a day, and that's also a first. Also another first, the first non-astronauts are aboard. They are scientists who are called payload specialists. They are experts on particular payloads, and one of the payload specialists is Dr. Ulf Merbold, a West German physicist who is the first non-American to fly in the American space program. This flight was originally scheduled to be launched on September 30th, but there were lots of problems, and there's been almost a 2-month delay in getting it off the pad. First of all, there were problems with that TDRS satellite. You remember that tracking data and relay satellite was launched by a previous shuttle mission, and once they got it out of the cargo bay and on its own in space, there was trouble getting it up high enough above the Earth to establish what they call a geosynchronous orbit, so that it appears to stand still and revolves at the same rate as the Earth revolves around its axis. That satellite is very important to this mission because Spacelab will be generating vast amounts of data which have to be relayed back down to Earth. As we look at the pad now, we can see that the final preparations are underway for the launch. The service arm, the access arm for the orbiter being rolled back. There's another arm up on the top, the very tip top of the main fuel tank, which is put there as a kind of an exhaust cap to draw off the gases from the vehicle so they don't interfere with the launch process. A minute 20 seconds to go now until the launch of STS-9. There was another problem after the last flight. They discovered that they came very close to disaster with one of the solid rocket boosters. Its insulation on the nozzle of the rocket where the flame comes out almost burned through. That could have caused the spacecraft to veer wildly and go off course. So they had to delay almost another month while they checked out the STS-9 vehicle and got it ready, made sure that that wouldn't happen on this mission. We're coming up now just about to 30 seconds before liftoff. Let's listen to Mission Control as they describe the final seconds before they go.
To the onboard computers. The Spacelab countdown is now complete. Coming up on the 30-second point, and we go for auto sequence start. The SRB hydraulic power units have started. These move the solid motor nozzles to steer the vehicle. T-minus 20 seconds. 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 10. We have go for main engine start. 8, 7.
And now we see the first indication of flame from the bottom of the rocket. The main engines are started. In just a second, the solid rocket boosters ignite. There they go, a Roman candle ride, that brilliant sun-like flame coming out of the tail. They're clear of the tower, moving rapidly up through the sky, arcing over. This will be the highest angle of ascent ever attempted with the shuttle. They will go straight up the east coast, if you want to put it on the ground track map, passing east of Nova Scotia and the maritime provinces of Canada. Here comes that thundering roar that we're so familiar with now, shaking our building, shaking ourselves as the rocket leaps into the sky faster and faster. The mighty engines putting out 104% of their rated thrust at this point. They're climbing toward a thin, high cloud cover, and they should be piercing it very shortly. This is indeed a steep ascent. You can tell with the naked eye. It's much more straight up in the air than previous ones have been, and they are on their way. Everything looking good at this point.
Roger.
They are through that cloud cover now and moving out of sight. The flame dims as they go behind the clouds. The crowd reacting with cheers and applause as they usually do. I might note that the crowd this year for this flight is very much smaller than what we have seen in the past, both here at the press location and out along the roads and the beaches surrounding the Space Center here in Florida. So off they go, and everything looks good at this point. Let's talk for just a moment about the Spacelab project a little bit more closely. We have noted that it is a European accomplishment, 10 years and $1 billion in the making. It also carries 73 experiments, lots and lots of them. And there are 2 missions or payload specialists aboard who will be responsible for conducting those experiments. They can't fly the spacecraft. They are payload specialists, but they can run the experiments, and that indeed they will do. Looking back out over the launch site now, this towering column of smoke beginning to bend and shift with the wind. Activity around the pad is coming back into view. They have this gigantic water purge system which goes off underneath the spacecraft when the flames start shooting out of the bottom of it to try to cool things down and keeping it from wrecking the pad, which nearly happened on the first space shuttle launch. So furious was the force of that ascent. What's the word from Mission Control? Anything on the line from them now?
First stage performance nominal. 36 miles altitude, 47 down. Velocity 4875.
That's the voice of
Distance 55.
Terry White in
altitude
Houston.
40.
Houston has now taken control of the spacecraft and all of its systems and all the ground operations thereof. The Cape Canaveral part of the mission ends as soon as the rocket clears the top of the launch tower.
Distance 70. Altitude 45.
70 miles away already.
Velocity
Less than 3 minutes into the flight.
5709.
The solid rocket boosters at this point, those two Roman candles that are strapped to the side of the main tank have since fallen away. They will be retrieved from the Atlantic Ocean and brought back to be used again another day on another flight.
Prior to the point of no return, or negative return call. Altitude 51, distance 103, velocity 6532.
The spacecraft is now past what they call the point of negative return. In other words, they are no longer able to turn around, come back here to the Kennedy Space Center and land on the long concrete runway here. They must now go across the Atlantic at least, should anything go wrong, which it hasn't.
Roger, copy.
All of the trajectory plots appear to be in normal ranges here in the control center.
Now, the next big event that we're going to have for the spacecraft is what they call press to MECO. In other words, let's go for it until we come to main engine cutoff at least. And there's a couple of minutes here where we can chat with my colleague at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Jackie Judd, who will be covering the most of the mission this next week and knows all about those 73 experiments on the Spacelab. Jackie, with 6 people up there, I imagine it must be pretty crowded in the spacecraft now. Have they made any special accommodations for the group? Okay, some trouble with our communications to Houston, but while they're working on trying to get Jackie Judd online here, we'll continue from this end at the Kennedy Space Center. As far as that Spacelab mission is concerned, the long delays that we've had, that flight was supposed to be launched on September 30th, has caused some problems for a lot of the experiments that are on board the European Spacelab. And here's why. They need clear, bright days over the northern hemisphere for Earth observation experiments, and they need a new moon at night for observing space and the Earth's atmosphere. And this late in the year, up here in November, cloud cover and bad weather are a problem. And many of the orbits at this point will now have little or no darkness for that photography. The low angle of the sun also makes problems for space and Earth's photography. NASA does have plans to refly many of the affected experiments, but of course a significant amount of data will be lost at this point. Dr. Ulf Merbold, the first foreigner, a West German physicist to fly on an American space vehicle, went into space wearing sensors attached to his body. That's part of an experiment to try to figure out the constant problem of motion sickness that most crews have had once aloft for the first couple of days at least. The sensors that he was wearing detected his eye movements, the way his eyes were moving during the ascent, and that is tied directly to the problems of motion sickness. They have made some accommodations in the crew cabin for the increased number of astronauts aboard this time. They've installed 3 bunks where people can get some shut-eye, and there were some modifications to the WCS, the waste containment system, the toilet, in other words, with which there have been many problems on many previous flights. There's the call for press to MECO. That means let's keep going with those main rockets burning until main engine cutoff time arrives, and that should be coming up in about a minute and a half from now. At MECO, they will be able to go into orbit. Their approximate velocity will be about 25,725 feet per second, and that's enough to push them up into space and into a semicircular orbit around the Earth. So far, everything has been going just fine for the crew of Shuttle 9. No problems from launch up until this point. Everything is smooth as butter as far as the countdown was concerned.
Distance 545, coming up on 20,000 feet per second. Altitude 16 nautical miles.
They're getting there just a little bit more now, and they will be in orbit. The external tank, we mentioned that the solid rocket boosters are retrieved from the ocean and used again, but the huge, big main tank to which the shuttle clings like a moth on liftoff is just dropped into the sea and forgotten about. It is not used again.
Feet per second.
8 minutes and 10 seconds into the flight now, and in about 10 seconds we should get that call, MECO, main engine cutoff.
Throttling down to 76 in the main engines. 164 feet per second, 738 nautical miles, 61 miles altitude.
25, 730, up at 292 feet per second.
Roger on the MECO.
All right, they have it. MECO, main engine cutoff, and in just a few seconds now, external tank separation, where the big tank falls off the spacecraft and into the sea.
External tank separated.
And there we go. They are on their way to orbit. So, for now, everything is looking very, very good for the flight of STS-9 with its international crew and the European Spacelab with its 73 experiments aboard. This is Christopher Glenn, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center in Houston.
CBS News, I'm Richard C. Hottelet.
We have main engine start, 3, 2, 1, solid motor ignition, and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Spacelab.
Everything came together in smooth harmony, the weather, the men, and the machines. Now, Space Shuttle Columbia is in orbit. Once again, as a matter of fact, this is Columbia's 6th mission. Jackie Judd at the Space Flight Center in Houston is following the flight.
The launch was picture perfect. The engines fired, enveloping Columbia in a cloud of white smoke. Liftoff sent the shuttle into the sky, trailed by a stream of fire from the solid rocket boosters. Then it disappeared into the clouds. Columbia is now in its first of 145 planned orbits, passing over Europe a short while ago and monitored by Mission Control.
If the Little Mermaid in Copenhagen Harbor should lift her bronze head slightly, she might get a glimpse of the orbiter as it overflies Central Europe, passing down over Berlin, Lodz, Poland, Sevastopol, and out over the Persian Gulf.
In a little over 4 hours, Spacelab, the European-built science laboratory carried inside Columbia, becomes operational. Its Spacelab proves itself as a means of testing in space what can't be tested on Earth. There will be other similar missions, and the beginning of a major new phase of the space program. Jackie Judd, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
The Soviet Union intends to set up a permanently manned space station. That word today from the official Communist Party newspaper Pravda. Aboard the station, mirrors to give sunlight to northern Soviet cities during the long Arctic winter. The report did not say when work on such a program would begin. Now this.
CBS News, this is Mitchell Krauss. The 6 astronauts of the Space Shuttle Columbia are now 2 hours into a planned 9-day orbital flight filled with a variety of experiments in the billion-dollar European Space Lab. It's the largest crew ever on a U.S. space flight and includes the first non-American West German physicist Ulf Merbold. Launch Director Al O'Hara praised veteran Columbia Commander John Young and those on the ground who engineered the flawless launch.
The team performed just beautifully, and I think it's attributed to the pride that they have in this program and the dedication that they have to our nation's space program. So I'm extremely proud of the launch team. It was just a perfect launch as far as we were concerned. We're very, very happy with it.
The flight is the 6th for Columbia and the 9th in the shuttle program. If all goes as scheduled, it will be the longest and most ambitious of the projects with the reusable shuttle vehicle. Planned experiments include work on space sickness, materials processing in orbit, and new observations of the Earth and the solar system. The Soviet Union might reverse itself and resume the Geneva talks on reducing medium-range nuclear missiles. That's what West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl said today was the gist of a letter he received from Soviet leader Yuri Andropov.
Main engine start, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start, 3, 2, 1. Solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Spacelab. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
The weather, as always, had threatened to delay the mission. Shuttle Mission 9, the launch of Columbia and the European Spacelab. The result of 14 years of work for the Americans and the Europeans. Shuttle has been up a little bit more than 2 hours from now. Its solid rocket boosters going into the Atlantic Ocean, some 125 miles of Jacksonville. They have been recovered. It's been an exciting mission so far. The payload bay doors open, and the TDRS satellite, which had not worked so well on test earlier this month, working pretty well so far for the 6-man crew, the largest ever. It's John Young's 6th flight into space. He's walked on the moon, he's flown the shuttle before, but he's still having fun.
The first time.
Columbia, Houston, we are go for orbit ops.
They talk to the space shuttle Columbia. Now, you can't talk to...
Hey, super.
All it takes is a hand radio.
Roger that. You guys are really getting on with the timeline.
This is so neat up here, John. You just can't believe it. It is really something.
We'll be transmitting on one...
I know that, John.
The 9-day mission just beginning. A lot of experiments, 72 in fact, on board Spacelab. The shuttle not only is a truck now, it's also a space platform. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
CBS News, this is Mitchell Krause. Now, crew members are checking out the communications from the lab after crawling through the tunnel connecting it with the shuttle Columbia. In about an hour, half the 6-man crew beds down for an 8-hour sleep period, and a rocket is fired to adjust the orbit. More CBS News in a moment.
Trip into Spacelab begins with a floating crawl through a 3-foot tunnel, 18-foot long. But first, you have to open the airlock door. First, the payload specialist tried it. They failed. Then the mission specialist came floating along. A few minutes later, even the commander and the pilot had abandoned the shuttle cockpit and were pulling on the tug door, too. Pilot Brewster Shaw made some comments.
You ought to be able to see us all working like dogs to do this thing.
You bet, Brewster. We saw you struggling with the hatch, and we just wondered if you had any words for us on that.
On the hatch was just shifting up a little bit when we'd unlock it, and it was snagging on the top dog grill. We finally figured that out and got it.
As they floated into Spacelab, the astronauts shook hands, the 2 Americans getting pats on the back from the European Ulf Nurbold. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
CBS News, I'm Douglas Edwards. Columbia and its record crew of 6 are reported progressing well and definitely down to business. Our reporter, Jackie Judd, is at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And Jackie, what's going on aboard Columbia right now?
Doug, because this is a round-the-clock operation, 3 of the astronauts, the red team, are off duty. They're supposed to be asleep to get ready for the overnight shift. The other 3, the blue team, are at work. Brewster Shaw's at the controls, Owen Garriott and Byron Lichtenberger in the Spacelab. And they're in the very early stages of carrying out some of the 70 scientific experiments that will be done during the 9 days. The Spacelab is a pretty roomy place to work. It's about the size of a bus on the inside. And to keep themselves stationary in a weightless environment, the scientists have foot stirrups to lock into. Spacelab is, of course, a first for the space program. And the astronauts and the ground control teams all seem very pleased so far. In fact, they are all confessing to each other that they are breaking out in goosebumps. And that's the view from the Johnson Space Center. Doug?
Jackie Judd in Houston.
Invested 14 years of diplomatic and scientific effort, and now the work is paying off this evening for the European Space Agency.
Welcome to Spacelab.
We're just moving into Spacelab right now.
The astronauts and the scientists aboard Columbia crawled into the Spacelab tucked in the shuttle's cargo bay early this afternoon, overcoming some minor problems with a stuck hatch that at one point had all 6 crew members trying to open the hatch connecting the shuttle to the Spacelab itself. Now they're getting down to work, working with the more than 70 experiments. This evening they've been working with experiments that could shed more light on the causes of space sickness. And they've been checking out whether men have an innate sense of the mass of an object, even when it has no weight. 2 of the more than 70 experiments that are finally getting to work on board the Spacelab this evening. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
This is the world.
world tonight. Good evening. I'm Douglas Edwards, CBS News.
The liftoff of the Space Shuttle Columbia, returning to space with 6 astronauts aboard.
2, 1, solid motor ignition, and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Spacelab.
That's the way it was at the Kennedy Space Center this morning. More from Jackie Judd at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
After a 2-month delay, NASA got what it wanted, a perfect launch. The delight of space travel hasn't worn thin for John Young, who also commanded the first shuttle mission. Just a few hours into the Monday mission, Spacelab became operational, with mission specialist Owen Gary relaying the thumbs up.
We're having a ball down here. We're just goosebumps.
Testing the worthiness of Spacelab is what this mission is all about, determining whether its scientific tools can perform experiments that can't be done on Earth. Spacelab is the invention of the European Space Agency. The joint venture between NASA and ESA goes further. On board Columbia is Ulf Merbold of West Germany, the first foreigner to fly a U.S. mission.
Roger,
We read you loud and clear. Very good, thank you. If this mission succeeds, the future for Spacelab includes many more flights into space, with the ultimate goal being a manned Spacelab permanently in orbit. Jackie Judd, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
NBC News, I'm Ann Taylor. Well, 3 astronauts are working, 3 are in their sleep period. That's what's happening now. Jay Barbary takes a look at what the astronauts will be doing.
The 6 astronauts have divided into 2 teams to transform the shuttle Columbia into an orbital research center. The Spacelab, located in Columbia's cargo bay, is equipped with a shirt sleeve environment for the crew. It is outfitted with 38 experiments ranging from astronomy to biomedical studies.
This trip is to last for 9 days with round-the-clock experiments.
Communications problems that have caused a loss of voice signals at times, but otherwise things are going pretty well aboard the Columbia Space Shuttle. I'm David Leslie. ABC's Jules Bergman at the Johnson Space Center in Houston tells us how the mission's going so far.
Payload specialist Dr. Byron Lichtenberg of MIT, attempting a space sickness test called hop and drop, reported that at 1G he experienced some discomfort and had to discontinue the test. In the experiment, the scientist pulls up on a bar and rubber cord, which is attached to a computer, and then he is dropped, creating Earth gravity in the weightlessness of space. It got to Lichtenberg, but astronaut Owen Garrett was able to continue. Spacelab headed for day 2 of its 9-day flight. Jules Bergman, ABC News at the Johnson Space Center.
Never said making history was supposed to be easy. And NASA's red team in the Spacelab could be green by the time this morning is over testing space sickness. Ulf Merbold is now the guinea pig, strapped to a chair that looks like it belongs in a Vincent Price movie. He's floating around looking at polka dots and other flashes of light inside his helmet. Bob Parker had this thrill earlier. It didn't sound like fun.
Bob seems to be closing his eyes all the time. He's got his eyes only halfway open. That's better. It seems like Bob is very sleepy. He's showing signs of very great sleepiness.
Another headache on this maiden flight of the Spacelab has turned out to be communications. KTRH's Doug Miller explains the crew's being bugged by hassles with their radios.
NASA can talk to Columbia's pilot from only a handful of stations on the ground. The Spacelab crew is lucky enough to be bouncing its signals off of the TDRS satellite. That means that scientists in orbit can spend more time conferring with scientists on the ground. The problem is that those radio signals have been occasionally scratchy, occasionally broken, and occasionally just not there. NASA's not sure what went wrong with the TDRS system. The problem could well be on the ground. Flight director Chuck Lewis sings the satellite's praises.
I hope the program is playing on this
So the scratchy radios may be something that NASA will have to learn to live with, even when it irons out most of the bugs in the troubled TDRS satellite system. At the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
A condemned man gets at least a little breathing room in Florida. The weather is getting better in most places. NASA is cracking the whip for 6 spacemen. Good morning, this is Doug Poling with the CBS World News Roundup. It's going pretty well, but there have been a few glitches, as Jackie Judd reports.
After nearly a full day in space, the shuttle mission is on schedule, although there have been some glitches with the equipment in Spacelab. The day crew struggled with a package that didn't want to come unbolted from a storage locker. The night crew had a camera that refused to flash during a motion sickness experiment.
We can't get the flash to fire. Roger, no flash. We sure feel kind of bad this morning with all this stuff going bad. But we don't think at the moment it's our fault. We hope.
The astronauts will be put through the rigors of more motion sickness experiments today, one designed by Dr. Millard Reschke, who suffers from motion sickness.
It's a very uncomfortable and distressing way to live. And hopefully, through investigations like this one, we will begin to unravel some of the basic questions.
It could be years before those questions are answered. Spacelab is sending back so much information, it will take that long to figure out what it all means. Jackie Judd, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
KTRH Houston. CBS News. This is Rob Armstrong. At Union.
Both European Ulf Mirbold and NASA's Bob Parker took turns being strapped into a floating chair while colored lights were flashed at their eyes. The results?
Seems like Bob is very sleepy. He's showing signs of very great sleepiness.
It was hard to believe that Parker could close his eyes with the alarms that went off inside Spacelab.
Hopefully the bell doesn't drive you crazy.
We've got out the little screwdriver and turned it down, so we don't hear any alarms to speak of at this point. Just had a continuous alarm otherwise.
The problem was a system that sends data from experiments on the platform outside Spacelab to the ground. All this put the crew behind schedule and in a rather foul mood. On the ground, they were expressing sympathy. The scientist Rick Chappell said testiness was expected.
What has to be a minimum first night's sleep, and then 12 hours of work, which is hard on you when you've had plenty of sleep. I think they did really well.
It's almost bedtime for Mirbold, Parker, and Young, the blue team now in control. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
Aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia have begun some 25 scientific experiments to test human adaptation to weightlessness. The mission's chief scientist, Dr. Richard Chappell, says the crew has been performing extremely well.
CBS News, I'm Dallas Townsend. Oh, well, aboard the orbiting Space Shuttle Columbia. Experiments are proceeding in the Space Lab. Still, there's a glitch.
This is Jackie Judd at the Johnson Space Center. A Spacelab computer the size of a bread box is puzzling NASA scientists because of its erratic behavior. The computer is called a RAU, a Remote Acquisition Unit. It takes in commands to trigger certain steps of experiments and then relays data about the tests. It stopped sending information last night. The theory is the RAU may have been overloaded, so the amount of information it received was reduced, but the computer broke down again late this afternoon. The RAU is essential to 2 experiments on Spacelab. One comes up in a few hours. The other one doesn't begin until the 8th day of the mission. This isn't a major problem for Spacelab, but it is a reminder that there are many kinks still to be worked out in this pioneering space venture. Jackie Judd, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
Days, light sleep, and heavy work. That, in a nutshell, explains why Spacelab crew members have become testy, complaining that the scientists on the ground are asking for too much too fast.
Hold on, please. We can't get all that right now. Can you hold on?
Whenever. So ground controllers here at NASA today were quick to heap on plenty of praise for jobs well done. Jobs like firing a particle beam, an electron beam, actually into space, to study the effect that creates the fabled northern lights. And most of the crew's day today, though, worked with a strange string of experiments, domes of flashing polka dots, cords of strong elastic, and miniature TV screens flickering dizzying patterns. It was all a part of an investigation into the causes of space sickness. Owen Garriott and Byron Lichtenberg just a few moments ago reported it's a lot like the simulations.
Very similar. After rotation stopped, I had counter rotation for a longer period of maybe several seconds, and that's about the only difference. What about your limbs, your arms and legs? Did you know where they were? Yeah.
Well, so far, no space sickness trouble reported on this flight. The trouble is still coming from the Tigris satellite system. It's still dropping out sometimes for no reason at all. And the computer that relays information to some of the Spacelab experiments is still intermittently failing. NASA doesn't know why. Well, the space agency hopes to try another solution in about 3 hours. The next shift is now coming on duty in the shuttle, no doubt hoping that NASA can solve this biggest problem on the maiden flight of Spacelab. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
Mutual News via satellite. I'm Mike McCluskey. House for a while.
Extremely pleased with the work being done on the Space Shuttle Columbia. The 6 crew members are working on an exhaustive series of tests, many of them testing man's reaction to weightlessness. The shuttle is now heading into its 3rd day in space.
7 o'clock on KTRH Houston.
A condemned man waits to die in Florida. A wealthy kidnap victim is freed in Holland. A 3rd day of science in space. Good morning. This is Doug Poling with the CBS World News Roundup.
Wake-up call for the blue team came up a little while ago. The red team going to sleep in about an hour. There are already some results coming in from the Spacelab experiments, 130 miles high. Scientists have discovered that there's the same amount of heavy hydrogen in the upper atmosphere as there is in the deepest part of the ocean. It may help explain the origin of the universe someday. That broken box that sends data from experiments to the ground from the pallet in the cargo bay is now fixed, and the Payload Operations Center says data on the radiation around Columbia is now coming in.
We're hearing nothing but superlatives from the CPAC team.
Nothing but superlatives, huh?
That's correct. Beautiful video.
That means we were lucky.
Nah, just good.
Some members of the crew are reportedly a little tired. One of the first signs that they're feeling the effects of zero gravity as they orbit above the Earth. Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News, live at the Johnson Space Center.
CBS News, I'm Charles Osgood. Convicted today aboard the orbiting space laboratory, the astronaut scientists are so busy they tend to lose track of time. That's not difficult. The crew sees the sun rise or set every 45 minutes, and the shuttle Columbia crosses the international date line at least a dozen times a day. So it's no wonder West Germany's Ulf Merbold called Mission Control this morning asking just what day is this anyway?
We're a little bit confused about the date here. Could you give us the accurate date? It's November the 30th?
That's affirmative, Ulf. November the 30th.
That was Dutch scientist Bubo Okos at Mission Control. Sounds as if he wasn't quite sure either.
CBS News, this is Rob Armstrong. Columbia today conducted experiments involving fusing and melting metals, testing the effects of weightlessness on the processes. Scientists want to analyze the data to see what exotic alloys and plastics might one day be produced in space.
Months for results of scientific experiments on earlier space flights to be revealed, but Spacelab has changed all that for good. Take the space physics experiment, for example. We have proven today a 70-year-old theory on Earth that gravity stimulates changes in the way we perceive our body's balance. It could lead to explanations of space sickness and motion sickness on Earth. We have learned that the Earth is a greater source for X-rays than we thought. X-rays are produced by stars during crucial stages of their evolution. And we have discovered that the same balance of heavy hydrogen, or deuterium, exists in the upper atmosphere of Earth as it does in the ocean. That could help to explain the origin of our galaxy and the origin of water on other planets like Venus. 35% of the land area of the world has been mapped adequately in the past 100 years by conventional procedures, and a metric camera that's been turned on board Columbia will now map the remainder of the world during this flight and several flights to come. The presence of scientists on Spacelab and their ability to talk directly with colleagues on the ground is certainly proving to be a remarkable way to speed up discoveries. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
CBS News, I'm Douglas Edwards. Performed by the Columbia shuttle astronauts today involves firing up powerful furnaces to melt and mix metal samples to create exotic alloys impossible to manufacture on Earth.
CBS News, I'm Carol Pazewski. Earth are hailing the success of the experiments being performed by the Columbia shuttle crew in space. The latest tests, they say, will provide clues about the magnetic fields that exist around the Earth. Earlier, the crew turned the Spacelab into a mini factory, mixing metals to create alloys impossible to make on Earth.
Is already paying off with some very significant discoveries, and scientists from around the world, gathered here in Houston, are ecstatic with the host of findings which are already changing the body of man's scientific knowledge. An update tonight from the Johnson Space Center from KTRH's Doug Miller.
Laboratory aboard Columbia is already altered the finding scientific knowledge. Take, for example, the shuttle's experiments on space sickness. They have proven a decades-old theory that gravity, and thus the lack of gravity, changes our perception of how our bodies are balanced, and that might be a key to a cure for space sickness. Over the past century, only 35% of the Earth's surface has been mapped by cameras probing its natural resources, and now cameras like the one flying on Spacelab will eventually photograph the rest of the world. And this afternoon, cheers erupted in a NASA control room as scientists from around the world watched a Spacelab experiment create an artificial glow around the shuttle. Astronaut Owen Garriott described the light show that was beamed back to Earth on television.
There's another firing, MPD firing.
As bright as a beacon on an aircraft liner.
Owen, this is CPAC. I can barely hear you through the cheers in the background.
And tonight there were more satisfied reviews, these about the shuttle itself. Flight Director Larry Bourgeois explaining just a few minutes ago that we haven't heard much about the orbiter itself for a very good reason.
The orbiter is probably doing better than we've seen before. We essentially have no significant system anomalies.
That's especially noteworthy since Columbia has been grounded for more than a year while Challenger stole the show. We have learned today that the Earth is a greater than expected producer of X-rays, and that could be a clue to the origin of our world. And we have learned that the same ratio of heavy hydrogen exists high in the Earth's atmosphere as deep in its oceans, and that could be a clue to the origin of our galaxy. So many discoveries in just 3 days proves that NASA and the European Space Agency were right. It pays to have scientists in orbit conferring with scientists on the ground.
We hear nothing but superlatives here.
Well, great. Well, for all your equipment down there, I'm pleased to hear it's working so well.
And that is the main lesson that they hope to prove on this maiden flight of Spacelab. Reporting live from the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
CBS News, I'm Vicki Kelly. Able to mix business and pleasure during this mission of the Space Shuttle Columbia. His primary job is working as one of 2 mission specialists, but he took along his hobby, working as a ham radio operator. The purpose was not to have a conversation, but to see who could be heard in space. The first ham operator to get through the spaceship was Ken Schnell, a budget analyst at the Johnson Space Center. Vicki Kelly, CBS News.
Economic matter could be turning political. More talks in Washington about Lebanon as another foreign soldier is killed in that country. Good morning, this is Doug Poling with the CBS World News Roundup. Columbia is about to enter its 4th day in orbit. The 6 astronauts today plan to conduct observations of the atmosphere. There was something new yesterday. Astronaut Owen Garriott used his ham radio aboard Columbia to try to get through to radio operators on Earth.
Calling CQ for North America, W5LFL. So W5LFL in Columbia is calling CQ and standing by. Go ahead.
In Los Angeles, ham operator Marty Wohl heard that and tried to answer.
W5LFL, W5LFL from N6VI, November 6, Victor, India.
Wohl kept on trying but never did reach Columbia. He had mixed feelings about that.
I'm disappointed to some extent in getting through, but again, there are other opportunities, and I am very excited the fact that we actually have heard him and that he came through clearly for quite a while, as you all heard.
Garriott said he did hear some transmissions. Some intelligence...
In Houston, it's news.
CBS News, I'm Marlene Sanders. Orbiting Spacelab, a short time ago, the crew took questions from reporters as Jackie Judd reports from the Johnson Space Center.
The astronauts are being worked hard in Spacelab, perhaps too hard. During the news conference, mission specialist Owen Garriott said that while the information collected from scientific experiments is good, there's not enough time to get all the data they want. Spacelab itself is holding up well. Byron Lichtenberg calls it an amazing vehicle.
I think Spacelab has lived up to all its expectations so far. We've been able to conduct life sciences, material sciences, fluid physics, some plasma physics experiments, and there are times when some of these experiments can be going on simultaneously with different crew members. Very versatile, very easy to work in here, and I think going to be very successful.
The astronauts may have an additional day to work in Spacelab. NASA is considering extending the 9-day mission. Garriott says the crew won't have any problem finding things to do with that extra time.
Specialists who've Meerbold Bob Parker have finally hit the sack after a busy and often testy morning, with both of them letting their angers fly when the commands from the ground kept coming and coming and coming.
Things are pretty hectic out here, Boo-Boo. There's 2 people up here trying to get all your stuff done. I think you might be quiet until we got one or the other of them done. Would you guys please tell us exactly what you want done when, and we'll forget about what else we're doing at the present time? Do you want us to get off out of the seat and we'll go and do all these things?
Negative, Bob. We want you now to...
Please hang on.
The last shuttle mission crew told reporters during their space press conference that they were the happiest crew ever. How does this crew feel?
I'm not sure we can claim we're the happiest crew, but we're the largest crew, so I think our happiness quotient is probably the largest. We're pretty ecstatic about the whole experience up here.
There's talk of extending this shuttle mission one day. The landing site is wet, and there'd be more time for experiments. No decision until this weekend is expected. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
Wet, dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base, and a forecast of more rain has NASA's brass mulling an extension of Spacelab's flight. That would give extra time on the ground for the lake bed to dry, and extra time in orbit for the crew to do its job. The tight Spacelab schedule has had tempers flaring once again today, with astronaut Bob Parker questioning commands from scientists here at NASA.
Why? You guys would recognize that there's 2 people up here trying to get all your stuff done. I think you might be quiet until we got one or the other of them done.
Well, that's true, Bob. However, we thought you were waiting for Cayuban acquisition at the moment, and the better...
Would you guys please tell us exactly what you want done when, and we'll forget about what else we're doing at the present time?
But there's one potential monkey wrench in this possibility of an extension. NASA has noticed this afternoon that hydrogen is leaking into a shuttle fuel tank. How much is not entirely clear. No crisis, but the leak could shoot down the idea of keeping the Spacelab in orbit an extra day. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
Chargers at 7:50 right here on KTRH Houston.
CBS News, I'm Dallas Townsend.
The dry lakebed landing site in California is wet. Well, they'd rather avoid landing Columbia with its heavy Spacelab cargo on a concrete runway. So NASA's brass is thinking about extending the mission by at least 1 day. Of course, crew members like Owen Garriott wouldn't mind that a bit.
Sounds like good news to me. If we can do that, why, I think that'd ease things up. I'm sure we'll find plenty of things to do in an extra day.
A longer mission might loosen up the tight timeline that once again today had tempers flaring. Witness this response of astronaut Bob Parker when ground scientists radioed him a command for a change in plans.
Why? You guys would recognize that there's two people up here trying to get all your stuff done. I think you might be quiet until we got one or the other of them done.
Well, that's true, Bob. However, we thought you were waiting for Cayuban acquisition at the moment, and the better...
Would you guys please tell us exactly what you want done when, and we'll forget about what else we're doing at the present time.
Well, so what's the problem? We put the question to Spacelab boss Harry Kraft. Are the scientists on the ground talking too much?
I think he's good. I think he's good with our words. The scientists are enthusiastic.
Tonight, there was trouble with what is perhaps Spacelab's most important piece of equipment, the main computer controlling the billion-dollar laboratory's experiments. They fixed the computer crash, but cleaning up the technical mess is setting the crew behind in its already hectic schedule. And one of the metals melted in Spacelab's experimental furnace apparently expanded too much tonight, and now sitting inside that orbiting oven, it's stuck. With headaches like that, it's no wonder Byron Lichtenberg was happy to end his long shift tonight and hit the sack.
Thank you all for the hard work today. It's been a long one.
Yeah, I'm sure, and you guys really be pat her on the back and really worked yourself to death.
You know, you got a nice South Houston to look forward to. Right now I'm looking out at the tail of the orbiter, looking down at the Earth go by, and it's just one fantastic view. Over.
Tonight, there's a very good chance the astronauts will get an extra day of science and sightseeing. NASA's decision on granting Spacelab an extra day in orbit is expected this weekend. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
CBS News, I'm Carol Pazewski. Your shuttle crew, said to be in continuing good spirits, is pressing on in its study of the Earth's atmosphere to learn how materials can be processed in space. At a ground-to-space news conference plagued by communication problems, the astronaut said the billion-dollar Spacelab has lived up to all its expectations. NASA officials say all is going well, and they may extend the 9-day mission an extra day.